Chapter 5 The White Ape. Tenderly, Calla nursed her little waif, wondering silently why it did not gain strength and agility as the little apes of the other mothers. It was nearly a year from the time the little fellow came into her possession before he would walk alone, and as for climbing, how stupid he was. Calla sometimes talked with the older females about her young, hopeful, but none of them could understand how a child could be so slow in learning to care for itself. Why, it could not even find food for it alone. And then more than 12 moons had passed since Calla had come upon it. Had they known about that child seen 13 moons before it came into Calla's possession, they would have considered its case absolutely hopeless, for the little apes of their own tribe were far advanced in 2 or 3 moons, as it were the little stranger after 25. Tublat, Calla's husband, was sorely vexed, but for the females, careful watching would have put the child out of the way. He will never be a great ape, he argued. Always you will have to carry him and protect him. What good will he be to the tribe? None. Only a burden. Let us leave him quietly, sleeping among the tall grasses, that you may bear the other stronger apes to guard us in his old age. Never, broken nose, replied Calla. If I must carry him forever, so it be. And then Tublat went to Kerchak to urge him to use his authority with Calla and force her to give up little Tarzan, which is the name they had given to the Lord Greystroke, which had meant white skin. But Kerchak spoke about her with Calla and threatened to run away from the tribe if they did not leave her child with peace. And as for one of the inalienable rights of the jungle folk, if they be dissatisfied among the other people, they borrowed her for no more. For Calla was a fine, clean-limbed young female, and they did not wish to lose her. As Tarzan made more rapid strides, so that the time he was 10 years old, he was an excellent climber, and that the ground could do wonderful things which were beyond his powers of his little brothers and sisters. In so many ways they differ from him. They often marveled at his superior cunning, but in the strength he was deficient, for the 10 great anthropoids were fully grown, then some towering the 6 feet over height, while little Tarzan was still but a full half-grown boy. Yet such a boy! From early infancy, he used his hands to swing from branch to branch after the manner of his giant mother, and he grew older as he spent an hour a day spending through the tree tops with his brothers and sisters. He sprang for 20 feet across space at dizzy heights at the forest top, and the grasp unerring precision without apparent jar, a limb waving wildly in the paths of the approaching tornado. And he could drop 20 feet and stretch a limb-to-limb rapid descent to the ground, or he could gain the utmost pinnacle of the loftiest tropical giant with ease and swiftness of a squirrel. Though but 10 years old, he was fully as strong as the average man of 30, and far more agile and practiced athlete ever becomes. His strength was increasing. His life among these fierce apes had been happy, for his recollection held no other life, nor did he know that he had existed within the universe aught else than his little forest and the wild jungle animals with which he was familiar. He was nearly 10 before he commenced to realize that the great difference existed between himself and his fellows. His little body, brown by exposure, suddenly caused him feeling intense shame, for he realized he was entirely hairless, like a low snake or other reptile. It was higher land which tribe frequented the little lake, and here was the Tarzan first saw the face in the clear, still waters of its bosom. It was on a sultry day of the dry season that one of his cousins had gone down to the bank for a drink. As they leaned over, both the little faces mirrored on the placid pool, the fierce and terrible creatures of the ape beside those aristocratic of the old English house, Tarzan was appalled, and it was enough to be hairless, but to own such countenance, he wondered if the other apes could look at him at all. That tiny slit of a mouth and those puny white teeth, how could they look beside the mighty lips and powerful fangs of more fortunate brothers? And it was more of a pinched nose, so thin that he looked half-starved. He turned red as he compared it with the beautiful, broad nostrils of his companion. Such a generous nose! Why, it was half spread across his face. It was certainly must be fine to be so handsome, thought poor little Tarzan. But when he saw his own eyes, there was the final blow. The brown spot, the gray circle, the white blank whiteness. Frightful, not even snakes had such hideous eyes as he. So intense he was upon his personal appraisement of his features that he did not hear the parting of the tall grass behind him as a great body pushed itself stealthily through the jungle, nor did his companion, the ape, hear either, for he was drinking, and the noise of his sucking lips and the gurges of satisfaction drowned quiet approach with the intruder. Not 30 paces behind the two she crouched, Saber, a huge lioness, lushing her tail. Cautiously, she moved toward the great padded paw forward, noiselessly placing it before she lifted to the next. Thus she advanced, her belly low, almost touching the surface of the ground. She kept preparing to spring upon its prey, and now she was within 10 feet of the two unsuspecting playfellows. Carefully she drew her hind feet well up beneath her body, the great muscles rolling under the beautiful skin. So low she was crouching now that it seemed to be flattened to the earth, except the upward bend of the glossy back it's gathering to the spring. No longer the tail lashed, quietly straight, and behind her lay. An instant she paused as though she turned to stone. Then, with an awful scream, she sprang. Saber, the lioness, was a wise hunter. One less the wild alarm of her fierce cry as she sprang, it would have seemed a foolish thing, for she could not more surely have fallen upon her victims had she but quietly leaped without a shriek. But Saber knew wondrous of quickness of the jungle folk and the most believable powers of hearing. To them, the sudden scraping of the blade of grass, another was an effectual warning as her loudest cry. Saber knew that she could not make that mighty leap without a little noise. Her wild scream was not without warning. It voiced to freeze her poor victims in a paralysis of terror for the tiny fraction of which the instant would suffice. Her mighty claws had sink into their soft flesh and hold them beyond the peradventure of escape. So far the ape was concerned. Saber reasoned correctly. The little fellow crouched trembling in an instant, but the instant was quite long enough to prove his undoing. Not so, however, with Tarzan, the man-child. His life amidst the dangers had taught him to meet the emergencies of the self-confidence, and his higher intelligence resulted in a quickness of mental action far beyond the powers of the apes. So the scream of Saber, the lioness, galvanized the brain and muscles of little Tarzan to the instant action. Before him lay the deep waters of the little lake. Behind him a certain death, a cruel death, beneath tearing claws of reddening fangs. The Tarzan had always hated water, except as a medium for quenching his thirst. He hated it because he connected with the chill and discomfort of the torrential rains, and as he feared for the thunder and lightning of which he accompanied them. The deep waters of the lake had been taught by his wild mother to avoid. And further, he had not seen little Nita sink beneath the quiet surface only a few short weeks before he would ever return to the tribe. But the two evils of his quick mind chose the lesser ear of the first note of Saber's scream had scarce broken the quiet of the jungle, and before the greatest beast of her hovered half a leap, Tarzan felt the chill of water so close to his head. He could not swim. The water was very deep, but he lost no particle of self-confidence and resourcefulness, which were the badges of his superior being. Rapidly, he moved his hands in an attempt to scramble forward, and possibly by more chance than design, he fell into the stroke of the dog when swimming, so that when the few seconds his noise was above water, so he found he could keep it there by continuing his strokes, and also making progress there. He was surprised and pleased with his new acquirement which had so suddenly thrust upon him, but there was no time for thinking much upon it. He was now swimming parallel to the bank where he saw the cruel beast would have ceased crouching upon his still form of his little playmate. Instead, he raised his voice in call of distress and common to his tribe, adding the warning which he would prevent would-be rescuers from running the clutches of Saber. Almost immediately there came an answer in the distance. Presently 40 or 50 great apes swung rapidly and majestically through the trees in a scene of tragedy. In the van was Kala. She had recognized the tones of her beloved, and with her was the mother of the little ape who lay dead beneath the cruel Saber. She, though the more powerful and better equipped for fighting than the apes, the lioness had no desire to meet these enraged adults, and the snarl of the hatred she sprang quickly into the brush and disappeared. Tarzan now swam to shore and clambered quickly upon the dry land, and feeling the freshness and exhilaration which the cool waters had imparted to him, filled his little being with grateful surprise, and ever he lost no opportunity to take a daily plunge in lake or stream or ocean, and when it was possible to do so. For a time, Kala could not accustom herself to the sight. Though her people could swim forced to it, they did not like to enter water, and never did so voluntarily. The adventure with the lioness gave Tarzan a pleasurable memories, for it was with such affairs which broke the monotony of daily life, otherwise but a dull round of searching for food, eating, and sleeping. The tribe which he belonged roamed a tract extending roughly 25 miles along the sea coast and some 50 miles inland. They traversed almost continually, occasionally remaining for months of the one locality, but as they moved through the trees with great speed, they often covered territory in very few days. Much depended on food supply, climatic conditions, and the prevalence of animals of the more dangerous species, although Kerchak often led them on long marches for no other reason than that he had tired of remaining in the same place. At nights, they slept where darkness overtook them, lying upon the ground, and sometimes covering their heads, more seldom their bodies, with the great leaves of an elephant's ear. One or two might lie cuddled with each other's arms for additional warmth, and the night were chill, and thus Tarzan slept in Kala's arms nightly for these years. That huge, fierce brute loved this child of another race is beyond question, and he, too, gave to the great, hairy beast the affection that all belonged to his fair mother she had lived. When he was disobedient, she cuffed him, it is true, and when he is never cruel to him, and was more often caressing and chastising him. Tublat, her husband, always hated Tarzan, and on several occasions had come near to ending his youthful career. Tarzan had never lost an opportunity to show that he had fully reciprocated his foster father's sentiments, and whenever he could safely annoy him or make faces at him or hurl insults upon him for the safety of his mother's arms or the slender branches of the higher trees, he did so. His superior intelligence and cunning permitted him to invent 1,000 diabolical tricks and add to the burdens of Tublat's life. Early in his boyhood, he learned from the ropes of twisting and tying grasses together, and These were forever tripping Tublat and attempting to hang him from some overhanging branch. By constant playing and experimenting, he learned to tie rude knots and these sliding nooses, and then he and the younger apes amused themselves. What Tarzan did, they tried to do also, but he alone originated and became proficient. One day, while playing thus, Tarzan was thrown up at his rope of fleeing companions, retaining the other by his grasp, and fell accident by the noose squarely about the ape's right neck, bringing him to a sudden and surprising halt. "Ah, here is a new game, a fine game," thought Tarzan, and immediately he attempted to repeat the trick, and thus, by painstakingly and continued practice, he learned the art of roping. Now, indeed, was the life of Tublat a living nightmare. In the sleep upon the march, night or day, he knew that the quiet noise slept about his neck and nearly choked him out of him. Kala punished Tublat, swore dire vengeance, and old Kerchak noticed and warned and threatened, but to no avail. Tarzan defied them all, and he, thin, strong noose continued to settle about Tublat's neck whenever he had least expected it. The other apes derived unlimited amusement from Tublat's discomfiture, and for Broken Nose was disagreeable old fellow whom no one liked anyway. In Tarzan's clever little mind, in many ways thoughts revolved. These black of his divine power for some reason. If he could catch his fellow apes with a long arm of grasses, why not saber the lioness? And it was a germ of a thought, however, which was destined to mull around his consciousness and subconscious mind until it resulted in a magnificent achievement. But that came in later years. Chapter 6. Jungle Battles. The wanderings of the tribe brought them often near the closed and silent cabinet by Little Locked Harbor. To Tarzan, this was always a source of never-ending mystery and pleasure. He would often peek into the curtained windows, or climbing upon the roof, peer down to the black depths of the chimney in vain endeavor to solve the unknown wonders that lay within those strong walls. His little childish imagination pictured wonderful creatures within, and he impossibility of forcing entrance added 1,000-fold to desire it to do so. He would clamber about the roof and windows for hours, attempting to discover the means of ingress, but to the door he paid little attention, for this was apparently as solid as the walls. It was as next to the visit to the vicinity, following the adventure with that old saber, that as he approached the cabin, Tarzan noticed that from a distance the door appeared through the independent part of the wall in which it was set, and for the first time it occurred to him he might prove the means of the entrance of which he so long eluded him. He was alone, as often as he was in the case of when he visited the cabin, for the apes had no love for it. The story of the thunderstick having lost the telling during these 10 years had quite surrounded the white man's deserted abode in the atmosphere of weirdness and terror for the simians. The story of his own connection with the cabin had never been told him. The language of the apes had so few words that they could talk but little of what they had seen in the cabin, having no words to accurately describe either the strange people or their belongings. And so, long before Tarzan was old enough to understand, the subject of their had forgotten by the tribe. Only in a dim, vague way had Kala explained to him that his father had been a strange white ape. But he did not know that Kala was not his own mother. On this day, then, he went directly to the door and spent hours examining it and fussing it with the white hinges, the knob, and the latch. Finally, he stumbled upon the right combination. The door swung creakingly open before his astonished eyes. For some minutes he did not dare adventure within, but finally his eyes became accustomed to the dim light, and the interior he slowly, cautiously entered. In the middle floor lay a skeleton, every vestige of flesh gone from the bones which still clung, the mildewed and moldered remnants of which had once been clothing. Upon the bed lay a similar gruesome thing, but smaller. Near the tiny cradle, by the third, a wee mite of a skeleton. To none of these evidences, a fearful tragedy of a long dead day did little Tarzan give but a passing heed. His wild jungle life ensured him that the sight of the dead and dying animals, he did not want to look upon the remains of his own father and mother would have been no more greatly moved. The furnishing of his other contents of the room, which riveted his attention, he examined many things minutely. Strange tools and weapons, books, papers, clothing, what little withstood the ravages of time, humid atmosphere in the jungle coast. He opened chests of cupboards, and which he did not baffle as a small experience, and these found contents much better preserved. For a long time this amused him, but finally tiring, he continued his explorations. In a cupboard he filled with books and came across the one brightly colored pictures. It was a child-illustrated alphabet. A is for archer, who shoots with a bow. B is for boy. His first name is Joe. The pictures interest him greatly. There were many apes with faces similar to his own, and over the book found the letter M, and some little monkeys saw him, which he daily fitting through the trees with primeval forest. But nowhere pictured any of his own people. In the book that resembled Kerchak or Tublat or Callum. At first, he tried to pick little figures from the leaves, but soon they were not real, and though he knew not might be, nor had any words to describe them, the boats, the trains, and cows and horses were quite meaningless to him, and did not quite so baffling as old as the odd figures which had appeared beneath and between the colored pictures, but some strange of bug thought he might be, for many of them led legs through nowhere and find one of it in a mouth. And it was his first introduction to the letters of the alphabet. He was over 10 years old. Of course, he had never seen print, nor spoken with any living thing that remotest idea was such a thing as a written language existed, nor ever had he seen anyone reading, nor so that what wonder that little boy was quite at a loss to guess the meaning of these strange figures, nor the middle of the book which he found his old enemy, Saber, the lioness, and further on, the coiled Hista, the snake. He put the book back in the cupboard and closed the door. He did not wish anyone else to find and destroy his treasure, and as he went out to gathering the darkness, he closed the great door and cabin behind him, and had seen before he discovered the secret of its lock, but before he left he had noticed his hunting knife lying where he had thrown it upon the floor, and he picked it up and took it to a slow show to his fellows. He had taken scarce a dozen steps toward the jungle, and great form rose before him from the shadows of a low bush. At first he thought it was his own people, but in another instant he realized it was Bolgani, the huge gorilla. So close was he taken, there was no chance to flight, for little Tarzan knew that he must stand for his life, and for these great beasts that were deadly enemies of his tribe. Neither one or the other asked for a grave quarter. He knew no fear, as he knew it. His little heart beat faster, and from the excitement and exhilaration of adventure, he had the opportunity presented itself, and he would escape. But his judgment told him that he was no match for the great thing that confronted him, and since he showed that successful flight was impossible, he met the gorilla squarely and bravely, without a tremor of a single muscle or any sign of panic. In fact, he met the brute midway in its charge, striking its huge body and close to fist as it frugally as he had been fly attacking an elephant, but he had still clutched the knife and found the cabin of his father. As the brute, striking and biting, closed upon the boy, accidentally turned the point toward the hairy beast, and sank it deep into the body of the gorilla, shrieked in pain and rage. But the boy had learned in a brief second to use a sharp and shining toy, so that, as for the tearing, striking beast dragged him to the earth and plunged his blade repeatedly into the hilt of its beast. The gorilla, fighting after its manner of its kind, struck terrific blows in its hand and tore at the flesh of the boy's throat and chest of the mighty tusk. A mile back in the forest, the tribe heard a fierce challenge of a gorilla, and it was his custom when any danger threatened. Kerchak called his people together, partly for the mutual protection against a common enemy, since his gorilla might be but one of party of several, and so that all members of the tribe were accounted for. But it was discovered that Tarzan was missing, and Tublat was strongly opposed to sending assistance. Kerchak himself had no liking for the strange little waif, so that he came to Tublat, and finally, with a shrug of his shoulders, turned back to the pile of leaves which he made for his bed. But Kalba was of a different mind. In fact, she had not waited but to learn that Tarzan was absent ere she had fairly through the matted branches toward the point of which cries the gorilla was painfully audible. Darkness had now fallen. An early moon was sending its faint light into the cast strange, grotesque shadows among the dense foliage of the forest. Here, there, and there the brilliant rays penetrated the earth, but for most part they only served to accentuate the Stygian blackness of the jungle's depths. The cries of the gorilla proclaimed that it was a mortal combat with some other denizen of a fierce wood. Suddenly these cries ceased, and the silence of death reigned throughout the jungle. Kala could not understand, for the voice of Bolgani had last raised the agony of suffering and death, but no sound had come her by which she was possibly to determine the antagonist. That her little Tarzan could destroy but a great bull gorilla she knew was to be improbable, and so, as she neared the spot of which the sounds of the struggle had come, she moved more wearily at the last slowly and extreme caution and traversed the low branches, peering eagerly at moon-splashed blackness and slime combatants. Presently she came upon them, lying a little open space full under the brilliant light of the moon, little Tarzan's torn and bloody form, and beside the great bull gorilla, stone dead. With a low cry, Kala rushed to Tarzan's side, and gathering the poor, blood-covered bloody to her breast, listened for a sign of life. Faintly she heard it, the weak beating of the little heart. Tenderly she bore him back to the inky jungle to where the tribe lay, and for many days and nights she sat guard beside him, bringing him food and water, brushing the flies and other insects from his cruel wounds. The medicine or surgery the poor thing knew nothing, but of which the lick wounds, and thus she could keep them cleansed. The healing nature might more quickly do her work. At first Tarzan would eat nothing, but rolled and tossed in wild delirium of fever. All he craved was water, and she brought him in only way she could, bearing it in her own mouth. No human mother could have shown a more unselfish or sacrificing devotion to this poor, wild brute and for the little orphaned waif whom fate had thrown into her keeping. At last she upbraided the boy, commenced to mend. No word of complaint passed his tight-set lips, the pain of wounds excruciating. With the stoicism of the brute who had raised him, he had endured his suffering quietly, preferring to crawl away from the others as he lay hurtled in some clump of tall grasses rather than to show his misery before their eyes. Kala alone he was glad to have with him, but now he was better and gone longer at a time in search of food, for the devoted animal had scarcely enough to support her own life while Tarzan had been so low, and it was in consequence reduced to the mere shadow of her former self. Chapter 7. The Light of Knowledge. After what seemed like an eternity to the little sufferer of was able to walk once more. From then, his recovery was rapid, so that another month and he was strong and active as ever. During his convalescence, he had gone over in his mind many times battle with a gorilla, and thought his was to recover wonderful weapon upon which he transformed from a hopelessly outclassed weakling to the superior and mighty terror of the jungle. Also, he was anxious to return to the cabin and continue his investigations of its wondrous contents. So, early in the morning, he set forth alone upon his quest. After a little search, he located the clean-picked bones of his late adversary, and close by, partly buried beneath the fallen leaves, he found the knife, now red with the rust and exposure to the dampness of the ground from which dried blood of the gorilla. He did not like to charge in its former bright and gleaming surface, but it was still a formidable weapon, and one which he meant to use to advantage whenever opportunity presented itself. He had in mind that no more would run after wanton attacks of old Tublat. In another moment he was in the cabin, and another short time again he thrown the latch and entered. His first concern was to learn of the mechanism of the lock, and this he did by examining it closely while the door was open, so that he could learn precisely what caused the door to hold the door, and so that which means had released it to his touch. He found it that he could close the lock and door from his cabin, and so that he did so, there would be no chance of his being molested while his investigations. He commenced a systematic search of the cabin, but his attention was soon riveted by the books of which seemed to exert a strange but powerful influence over him, so that he could scarce and aught else for the lure of wondrous puzzle and the purpose presented him. Among the other books were a primer, some child's readers, numerous picture books, and a great dictionary. All these he examined, but the picture caught his fancy most, though the strange little bugs covered the pages where there were no pictures excited his wonder of the deepest thought. Squatting upon his haunches on the tabletop, the cabin and his father had built, his smooth, brown, naked little body bent over the book which rested in his strong, slender hands, and great shock of long black hair falling as well-shaped head and bright, intelligent eyes. Tarzan of the Apes, little primitive man, presented a picture filled at once with pathos and promise. The allegorical figure had primordial groping through which the black night of ignorance toward the light of learning. The little face was tense and steady, for he had partially grasped, in hazy, nebulous way, rudiments of thought which he destined to prove the key was the solution of the puzzling problem, strange little bugs. In his hands was a primer opened at a picture of the little ape similar to himself, but covered except the hands of the face, strange colored fur, for which he thought the jacket was trousers to be. Beneath the picture were these three little bugs. Boy. And now that he had discovered the next upon the page that these were repeated many times in the same sequence, another fact he learned, and there were comparatively few individual bugs, but they were repeated many times, occasionally alone, but more often with company of others. Slowly he turned the pages, scanning pictures and text for repetition of combination of B-O-Y. Presently he found beneath a picture and another of a little ape and strange animal with four legs, and a jackal resembled him not a little. Beneath the picture of the bugs appeared a boy and a dog. And there they were, the three little bugs which always accompanied the little ape. And so he progressed very, very slowly, and for it was a hard and laborious task he had set himself without knowing it. A task which might seem to you or me impossible. Learning to read without having slightest knowledge of letters, written language, or the faintest idea of such things that existed. He did not accomplish it in a day, or in a week, or in a month, or in a year, but very, very slowly. He learned after the grasp of the possibilities in which those little bugs, so that By the time he was 15, he knew various combinations of letters which stood for every pictured figure in the little primer and in one or two of the picture books. Of the meaning, he used to articles and conjunctions, verbs and adverbs and pronouns. He had the faintest and haziest conception. One day, when he was about 12, he found a number of lead pencils and with a hit-harrow undiscovered drawer beneath the table, and scratching upon the tabletop with one of them, he was delighted to discover the black line left behind it. He worked so assiduously with his new toy that the tabletop was soon a mass of scrawly loops and irregular lines and a pencil worn down the wood. Then he took another pencil, but this time it had a definite object in view. He would attempt to reproduce some of the little bugs and that scrambled the pages in his books. It was a difficult task, for he held a pencil as it would grasp a hilt of a dagger, but it did not add greatly to ease in writing or nor to the legibility of the results. But he persevered for months. At such times he was able to come into the cabin, but until at last, by repeated experimenting, he found his position in which to hold the pencil it best permitted him to guide and control it, so that he could roughly reproduce any of the little bugs. Thus he made a beginning at writing. Copying the little bugs taught him another thing, their number. And though he could not count as we understood it yet, he had an idea of quantity, his base calculations being a number of figures on one of his hands. His search, though, through the various books convinced him that he had discovered the different kinds of bugs, often repeated in combination, and these arranged in the proper order of the great ease of the frequency of which he had pursued the fascinating alphabet picture book. His education progressed, but his greatest finds were inexhaustible storehouse in a huge illustrated dictionary, for he was more through the medium of pictures than text, even after he had grasped the significance of the bugs. When he discovered the arrangement of the words in alphabetical order, he was delighted in searching and for finding combinations in which he found familiar, and words which followed. Their definitions led them still further into the mazes of education. By the time he was 17, he learned to read the simple child's primer and had fully realized the true power and wonderful purpose of the little bugs. No longer did he feel shame of his hairless body or his human features, for now his told him that he was of a different race, and of his wild and hairy companions. He was a MAN, and they were APES. And the little apes which scurried through the forest tops were MONKEYS. He knew, too, that Old Saber was a LIONES, and Hista was an SNAKE, and Tantra was an LEELEPHANT. And so he learned to read. From that, when his progress was rapid, he, with the help of the great dictionary and active intelligence of a healthy mind endowed by inheritance with more ordinary reasoning powers, and he truly guessed at which much he could not really understand, and more often than not his guesses were close to the mark of truth, and there were many breaks in his education caused by the migratory habits of his tribe, but even when removed from recourse to his books, his active brain continued to search out the mysteries of the fascination avocation. Pieces of bark and flat leaves and even smooth stretches of bare earth provided him with copy books whereon to scratch the point of the hunting knife with the lessons was learning. Nor did he neglect the sterner duties of life, and with following the bent inclination toward the solving mystery of his library. He practiced with his rope and played with the sharp knife with which he had learned to keep by wenting upon flat stones. The tribe had grown larger since Tarzan had come among them, and for under the leadership of Kerchak they had been able to frighten the other tribes from their part of the jungle, so that they had plenty to eat and little or no lost predatory incursions of neighbors. Hence, the younger males had become adult, and it found more comfortable to take wives from their own tribe, or they captured one of another tribe to bring in her to the Kerchak's band and live in amity with him, rather than to attempt to set up a new establishment of their own, or fight with the redoubtable Kerchak of supremacy at home. Occasionally, one more ferocious than fellows would attempt the latter alternative, but none had come yet could wrest the palm of victory in fierce and brutal ape. Tarzan had peculiar position in the tribe. They seemed to consider him one of them, and yet many way different. The older males either ignored him entirely or else hated him and vindictively, so that the wondrous agility, speed, and fierce protection of huge Kala would have been dispatched and early aged. Tublat was the most consistent enemy, but through Tublat, when he was about 13, the persecution of his enemy suddenly ceased, and he was left severely alone, except on the occasions on when them ran amok in the throes of those strange, wild fits of insane rage which attacks the males of only fiercer animals of the jungle. Then none was safe. On the day that Tarzan established his right to respect, the tribe gathered about a small natural amphitheater, which the jungle had left free from its entangling vines and creepers, and a hollow amongst the low hills. In an open space was almost a circular shape. Upon every hand rose the mighty giants and untouched forest, with a matted undergrowth banked so closely between the huge trunks that only into a little level arena through which the upper branches of the trees. Here, from safe interruption, the tribe often gathered. In the center of the amphitheater was one of those strange earthen drums with which the anthropoids, but built from queer rites of which men heard from the fastness of the jungle, but which none have ever witnessed. Many travelers have seen the drums of the great apes, and have heard the sounds of the beating noise in the wild, but the revelry of these first lords of the jungle. But Tarzan, Lord Greystroke, is doubtless only human being who has ever joined in the fierce, mad, intoxicating revel of the dum-dum. And from this primitive function has arisen unquestionably from in all forms of ceremonials in modern church and state through the countless ages beyond that last uttermost ramparts of drawing humanity, or our fierce, hairy forebears danced out from the rites of dum-dum to the sound of their earthen drums. Beneath the blight a tropical moon in the depth of a mighty jungle which stands unchanged today has stood at long forgotten in the dim, unthinkable vistas of the long past when our first shaggy ancestors swung and swang dropped lightly upon the soft turf of the first meeting place. On the day that Tarzan won his emancipation from the persecution that followed him remorselessly for 12 years of 13 years of life, the tribe had now fully 100 strong, trooped silently through the lower terrains of the jungle, and dropped noiselessly upon the floor of the amphitheater. The rites of the dum-dum were marked important events of the life of a tribe. A victory, a capture of a prisoner, the killing of a large, fierce denizen of the jungle, a fierce or ascension of a king, and conducted of a set of ceremonialism. Today, it was a killing of a giant ape, a member of another tribe, and as the people of Kerchak entered the arena, the two mighty bulls might have been seen burying the body vanquished between them. They laid their burden before the earth drum and then squatted beside the guards, while the other members of the community curled themselves grassy nooks to sleep until the rising moon should give the signal for the commencement of their savage orgy. For hours, absolute quiet reigned in the little clearing, except as it was broken by the discordant notes of brilliantly feathered parrots, or the screeching and twittering of 1,000 jungle birds flittering carelessly amongst the vivid orchids and the flamboyant blossoms which festooned the myriad, moss-covered branches and the forest kings. At length, as the darkness settled upon the jungle, the apes commenced to bestir themselves, and soon they formed a great circle about the earthen drum. The females and the young squatted in thin line in the outer periphery of the circle, while just in the front of the range of the adult males before the drum sat in the old females, each armed with a knotted branch 15 or 18 inches length. Slowly and softly they began tapping upon the resounding surface of the drum, and first faint rays of the ascending moon slivered in the circling treetops. As the light in the amphitheater increased, the females augmented the frequency and force of their blows until presently a wild, rhythmic din pervaded the great jungle for miles in every direction. Huge, fierce brutes stopped their hunting with up-pricked ears and raised heads to listen to the dull blooming to be tokened the dum-dum of the apes. Occasionally it would have rise to shrill scream or thunderous roar, answering challenge, savage din, and the arthropods, but nothing came near to investigate or attack, for the great apes, assembled in all their power of their numbers, filled the breasts of their jungle and neighbors with deep respect. Standing erect, he threw his head far back, looking to the eye of the rising moon, and he beat upon his breast with a hairy paws and emitted his fearful roaring shriek. Once, twice, thrice, that terrifying cry rang out across the seeming solitude of the unspeakable, quick, yet unthinkably dead world. Then, crouching, Kerchak slunk noiselessly around the open circle, veering far away from the dead body lying before the altar drum, but as he passed, keeping his little fierce, wicked, red eyes upon the corpse, another male then sprang into the arena, repeating the horrid cries of the king, followed stealthily to his wake. Another and another followed quick in succession until the jungle reverberated with now almost ceaseless notes of their thirsty screams. It was the challenge and the hunt, and when the adult males had joined them in the thin line of circling dancers, the attack commenced. Kerchak, seizing the club from the pile of which lay at hand for the purpose, rushed furiously upon the dead ape, dealing a corpse of terrific blow. At the same time, the emitting growls and snarls of combat, the din drum was now increased, and as well as the frequency of the blows, and the warriors, as each approached the victim of the hunt, delivered the Bulgian blow, joined the mad whirl of death dance. Tarzan was now of the wild, leaping horde, his brown, sweat-streaked, muscular body glistening in the moonlight, his shown supple and graceful among the uncouth, awkward, hairy brutes upon him. None more craftily stealthy in the mimic hunt, none more ferocious than he in the wild ferocity of the attack, nor none who leaped so high into the air of the dance of death. As noise and rapidity of the drum beats increased and the dancers apparently became intoxicated with the rhythm of the savage yells, their leaps and bounds increased, the bared fangs of dripped saliva, and their lips and breasts were flecked with the phloem. And half an hour the weird dance went on, until a sign of Kerchak, the noise of drum ceased, the female drummers scampering hurriedly through the line of dancers and the outer rim squatting spectators. Then, as one man, males rushed headlong upon the thing which their terrific blows had reduced them to the mass of a hairy pulp. Flesh seldom came to their jaws in satisfying quantities, so it set fit finale to their wild revel. It was a taste of fresh killed meat, and so there was the purpose of devouring their late enemy. Now they turned their attention. Great fangs sunk into the caress, tearing away huge hunks, the mightiest of apes obtaining the choicest morsels. while the weaker circled the outer edge of fighting, snarling pack awaiting the chance to dodge, and the snatch chopped the tibbets of the filch remaining bone before all was gone. Tarzan, more than the apes, craved and needed flesh. Descended from the race of meat-eaters, never in his life, he thought, had once more satisfied his appetite for animal food. And now his agile little body warmed its way into the far mass of the struggling, rending apes in an endeavor to obtain the share which his strength had been unequal to the task of winning for him. It was the side hung to the hunting knife, the unknown farther, in a sheath self-fashioned in copy of one of the seen among the pictures of the treasure books. At last he reached his fast-disappearing feast with a sharp knife and more generous portion than he had hoped for, an entirety of hairy forearm, where it produced beneath the feet of the mighty Kerchak, who was busily engaged in perpetuating the royal prerogative of hogging, that he failed to note the act of lèse-majesté. So little Tarzan wriggled out from beneath the struggling mass, clutching his grisly prize close to his breast. Almost the circling fealty of the outskirts of the banqueteers of the old Tublat he had among the first feast, but he had retreated with a goodly share in quiet, and it was now on his way for more. So it was that he spied Tarzan as a boy emerge from the clawing, pushing throng with a hairy forearm he hugged firmly into his body. Tublat's little close-set, bloodshot pig eyes were wicked gleams of hate as they fell upon the object of his loathing. In them, too, was agreed for the threesome daintily the boy carried. But Tarzan saw his arch-enemy as quickly, as divining as the great beast as would do, leaped away toward the women and children, hoping to hide himself among them. Tublat, however, was close upon his heels, so that no opportunity to seek place of concealment, but saw that he would be put to it to escape it all. Swiftly he sped, surrounding the trees, an agile bound gained to the lower limb at one hand, and then, transferring his burden to his teeth, he climbed rapidly upward, closely followed by Tublat. Up they went to the waving pinnacle of the lofty monarch in the forest, which the heavy pursuer dared not to follow him. There he perched, hurling taunts and insults at the raging, foaming beast 50 feet below. And then Tublat went mad. With a horrifying screams, it roared. He rushed to the ground, among females and young, sinking their great fangs into the dozen tiny necks of the great tearing pieces of the backs of beasts of females who fell into his clutches. In the brilliant moonlight, Tarzan witnessed the whole mad carnival of rage. He saw the females and the young scamper for the safety in the trees. Then the great bull is in the center of the arena, and mighty fangs of their demented fellow, and then the cord melted to the black shadows of the overhanging forest. There but one of the amphitheater besides Tublat, belated female running swiftly toward there where Tarzan perched, and those closely behind the awful Tublat. It was Kala, and as he was quickly as Tarzan, as Tublat gaining on her as he dropped the rapidity of the falling stone from branch to branch toward his foster mother. Now he was beneath the overhanging limbs, and as close as above her crouched Tarzan, awaiting to outcome the race. She leaped into the air, grasping a low-hanging branch, but almost over the head of Tublat. So nearly had he distanced her, she had been so safe now, and he was rending, tearing sound the branch. He precipitated her full upon the head of Tublat, knocking him to the ground. Both were up in an instant, but as quickly as they had been, Tarzan had been quicker, and so that the infuriated bull found himself facing the man-child who had between him and Kala. Nothing could have suited the fierce beast better, and with a roar he leaped upon the little Lord Greystoke, but his fangs closed in a nut brown flesh. The muscular hand shot out of grasp with a hairy throw, plunged another keen hunting knife a dozen times in the broad breast, like like lightning, the blows fell, and only ceased when Tarzan felt the limb of form crumple beneath him. As the body rolled the ground, Tarzan placed the neck upon the lifelong enemy, raising his eyes in the full moon, threw back the fierce young, and heard voiced the wild and terrible cry of his people. One by one, the tribe swung from their arboreal retreats and formed the circle about Tarzan and his vanquished foe. And when all had come, Tarzan toward them. "I am Tarzan," he cried. "I am a great killer. Let all respect Tarzan of the Apes and Kala, his mother. There be none among you as mighty as Tarzan. Let his enemies beware." Looking full into the wicked red eyes of Kerchak, the young Lord Greystoke beat upon his mighty breast and screamed out once more his shrill cry of defiance. Chapter 6. The Treetop Hunter. The morning after the Dum-Dum tribe slowly started back through the forest toward the coast, the body of Tublat lay where it had fallen, for the people of Kerchak did not eat their own dead. The march was but a leisurely search for food: cabbage, palm, and gray plum, pincing and scatamine from the abundance, and with a wild pineapple, and occasionally small mammals, birds, eggs, reptiles, and insects. The nuts they cracked between the powerful jaws, or if too hard, broke by pounding between stones. Once old Saber, crossing their path, sent scurrying to the safety of the higher branches, for if he respected the number of their sharp fangs, and they had their part of their cruel and mighty ferocity of equal esteem. Upon a low-hanging branch sat Tarzan directly above the majestic, supple body as it forged through the thick jungle. He hurled the pineapple at the ancient enemy of his people, and the great stopped and turning, eyes the taunting figure above her. With an angry lash of her tail, she bared her fangs, curling her great lips in the hideous snarl, and wrinkled the bristling snout of serrated ridges, and closed her wicked eyes to two narrow slits of rage and hatred. With black-laid ears, she looked straight into the eyes of Tarzan of the Apes, and sounded her fierce, shrill challenge. And from the safety of his overhanging ape child sent back a fearsome answer of his kind. For an answer of his two eyes eyed each other in silence, and a great cat turned into the jungle, which swallowed her as the ocean engulfs the tossed pebble. At the bottom of his little English heart beat the great desire to cover the nakedness with clothes, for which he had learned from the picture of the men were so covered, and the monkeys and apes and everything other living thing went naked. Clothes, therefore, must be truly a badge of greatness and insignia of the superiority of man over all other animals. For surely there could be no other reason for wearing these hideous things. Many moons ago, when he had much been smaller, when he had desired the skin of Saber, the lioness, or Numa, the lion, or Sheeta, the leopard, and cover the hairless body that might no longer resemble the hideous Hista, the snake, so now that he was proud to sleek the skin of the betoken and descent from the mighty race. The conflicting desires to go naked and the prideful proof of his ancestry to conform the customs of his own kind and wear hideous and uncomfortable apparel found first one then to another in ancestry. As the tribe continued slow through their forests, after passing the Saber, Tarzan's head filled the great scheme for slaying the enemy, and for many days thereafter he thought of little else. On this day, he presently had other and more immediate interests to attract his attention. Of the sudden, it became as midnight. The noises of the jungle ceased, and the trees stood motionless through the paralyzed expectancy of some great immediate disaster. All nature waited, but not for long. Faintly from a distance came a low, sad moaning. Nearer and nearer it approached, mounting the louder and louder in volume. The great trees bent in unison through the pressed earthward by a mighty hand. Further and further toward the ground they inclined, and still no sound save the deep and awesome moaning of the wind. Then suddenly the jungle giants whipped back, lashing their mighty tops in angry and deafening protests. A vivid, blinding light flashed from the whirling, inky clouds above, and the deep canode of the roaring thunder belched forth its fearsome challenge. The deluge came, and hell broke loose upon the jungle. The tribe huddled, shivering from the cold rain, and at the bases of the great trees, the lightning darting, the flashing through the blackness, showed wildly waving branches, whipping streamers and bending trunks. Now and again, some ancient patriarch of the woods, rent by flashing bolts, would crash into 1,000 pieces among the surrounding trees, carrying down numberless branches and many smaller neighbors, and to add the tangled confusion of the tropical jungle. Branches, great and small, torn away by the ferocity of the tornado, hurled toward the wildly waving vendor, carrying death and destruction to the countless unhappy denizens of the thickly peopled world below. For hours of the fury storm continued without surcease, and still the tribe huddled close in shivering fear, in constant danger of falling trunks and branches, paralyzed in the vivid flashing and lightning and bellowing of thunder, and crouched a pitiful misery until the storm passed. The end was as sudden as the beginning, and the wind ceased. The sun shone forth. Nature smiled once more. The dripping leaves and branches and the moist petals of the gorgeous flowers glistened in the splendor among the returning day. And so, as nature forgot, her children also forgot. The busy life went as it had been before at the darkness of the fright. But Tarzan was a dawning light had come to explain the mystery of clothes. How snug it would have been to the heavy coat of Saber, and it was also added further incentive to his adventure. Several months the tribe hovered near the beach and stood where Tarzan's cabin, and his studies took the greater portion of this time. But always when journeying through the forest he kept his rope in readiness, and many were in the smaller animals that fell into the snare of the quick thrown noose. Once it fell about the short neck of the horsea, the boar, and the mad lungs of freedom toppled Tarzan from the overhanging limb, and where he had lain in wait, and from whence he had launched his sinuous coil. The mighty tuskit turned, and the sound of the failing body, only seeing the easy prey of the young ape, he lowered his head and charged madly into the surprised youth. Tarzan, happily, was uninjured and by the fall, alighting cat-like upon all fours and outspread take up the shock. He was on his feet in an instant, and leaping with the agility of a monkey, he gained the safety of how low a limb of horsea. The boar rushed futilely beneath. Thus it was Tarzan learned by experience the limitations as well as the possibilities of this strange weapon. As he lost the rope on his occasion, he knew that it had been Saber, the one he had dragged from his perch, and the outcome might have been different, for he has lost his life, doubtless, into the bargain. It took him many days to braid the new rope, but when finally it was done, and went forth purposely to hunt and lie among the foliage of the great branch right above when the well-beaten trail led to the water. Several small animals passed unharmed beneath him. He did not want such insignificant game. It would take a strong animal to test the efficiency of this new scheme. At last she came whom Tarzan sought, with a lithe shrews rolling beneath her shimmering hide, the fat, glossy came Saber, the lioness. her great padded feet and the noiseless of the narrow trail, her head ever alert attention. Her long tail moved slowly in the sinuous, graceful undulations. Nearer and nearer she came to where Tarzan of the Apes crouched upon his limb, the coils of the long rope poised ready to in his hand. Like a thing of bronze, motionless as death, as sat Tarzan, saber passed beneath. One stride beyond his shock, a second, a third, and silent coil shot above her. And for an instant, the spreading noose above her head like a great snake, and then she looked upon the detect origin of the swishing sound of the rope. As it settled, with a quick jerk of Tarzan snapped the noose tight about the glossy throat, and then he dropped the rope and clung to the support of both hands. Saber was trapped. And with a bound and startled, breasted into the jungle, but Tarzan was not to lose the rope and through the same cause of the first. He had learned from experience. The lioness had taken but a half a second bound and felt the rope tighten around her neck. Her way turned completely over in the air, and when she fell with a heavy crash upon her back, Tarzan had fastened the rope securely the trunk and the great tree and which she sat. Thus far planned, for he had worked to perfection when he had grasped the rope, bracing himself up behind a crotch of two mighty branches. He found that dragging the mighty, struggling, clawing, biting, screaming mass of iron-muscled fury up to the tree and hanging her with a very different position. The weight of old Saber was immense, and while she braced her huge paws, nothing less than Tantor, the elephant himself, could have budged her. The lioness was now back in the path where she could see the author of indignity and had placed her upon her. Screaming with rage, and she had suddenly changed, leaping high into the toward Tarzan, but with her huge body struck the limb of Tarzan was no longer there. Instead, he perched lightly upon the smaller branch 20 above the raging captive. For a moment, Saber hung half across the branch, while Tarzan mocked the hurled twigs and branches of her unprotected face. Presently, the beast dropped to the earth, and Tarzan came quickly to seize the rope. But Saber now found that it had been only a slender cord that held her, and grasping her huge jaws severed before Tarzan could tighten and strangling noose for the second time. Tarzan was much hurt, but his well-laid plan had come to naught, and so he there screaming at the roaring creature beneath him, making mocking grimaces. Saber had paced back and forth beneath the tree for hours. 4 times he had crouched and sprang dancing sprite above her. But as he well clutched the elusive wind and murmured through the treetops, at last Tarzan had tired of the sport, and with the parting roar of challenge and well-aimed fruit spread soft and sticky over the snarling face of the enemy, he swung rapidly through the trees, 100 feet above the ground, and with a short time among the members of his tribe. Here he recounted the details of his adventure, and with a swelling chest, so considerable swagger that he was quite impressed with utmost bitterest enemies, while Callas fairly danced for pride and joy.